All right. So, um, let's get started. So, where we left off last time, we started to do collisions, and this is one of the most essential things that we're going to have to do when making a game because once you have the player moving, it's all about just figuring out, like, yeah, I'm bumping into that, and therefore I should do a thing. That is 99% of what games are. I press a button, I'm going to do this, uh, I hit this thing, I should do that. That is all that games are at their core. Um, One thing that we are able to do to help like set up objects in our games is we can make these handy dandy assets. This is a prefab. And what I did was I just made like two square sprites. I can open up this prefab here. It is two squares. Well, they're called squares. They're more like rectangles. And they have these box colliders on them. They do not have a rigid body, which means they can't move. However, they have a box collider, which means it has the ability to be detected. And like, if I bump into it, Unity has the ability to register the fact that I bumped into that, which is very, very helpful. And what I did was I just made this little plus sign and I made it a prefab just by, uh, give it a second. So I just took one of these and I dragged it down here into my assets folder, and that created a prefab. And then I was able to duplicate it really, really fast, and I was able to build this little like grid. Um, the biggest thing with collisions is that you have the right type of collider. This is a recap for those who were here last time. Um, So this is what a box collider looks like as soon as you add one. To add a box collider, you just hit add component, and then you can type in collider, and it'll show you every type of collider. When you're working in 2D, make sure that you're using a 2D collider, otherwise it doesn't work. Ask me how I know. Every single time I try to make colliders. Anyway, so make sure that you have the different types of colliders are just different shapes. So just pick a shape that fits what you're doing best. Uh, when you're doing rectangles, you're probably going to do a box. If you're doing circles, use a circle, stuff like that. And you can use fancier types of colliders when you have fancier sprites, or you can just use a whole bunch of boxes. So if you're familiar with like, oh yeah, the hitboxes are all off in this fighting game, that that's what they're talking about. And then Unity has two different types of ways of recognizing a collision. One of them is uh, standard, I suppose, and then the other one is trigger. So a standard collision, I guess I can demonstrate the difference real quick. So the walls have standard collision, and the coins have trigger collision. I want someone to tell me the difference between what's going on. So this wall, that's standard collision, and the coin, no. How about I use this wall? So this middle wall here has, does it? I don't think it has any colliders on it. I'll make it a trigger to show the difference. So this one, uh, I'll move it. I'll have one box here, and it'll have. All right, let's do a little experiment. Experiment. So this one is a trigger, I suppose, and this one is standard. What's the difference? Can anyone tell me?
You always stop at the standard
Yeah.
collider?
By default, a collision will always prevent you from being able to bump through it, but a trigger uh, doesn't. So a trigger won't stop you from moving through it. You are exactly right. So, if you're trying to figure out, oh, do I use a trigger or do I use a regular collision? Well, figure out, am I trying to um, pass through it or do I not want to pass through it? Another handy thing is when you're making a prefab or you're copying things, make sure you add all the components that you actually need. Otherwise, you have to go through and add it all separately. Like I just had to there. I could have saved some time by already adding on the component before I copied things. Also, if you want to see where your collider is, you see this like weird little thingy here. If you click on that, it'll highlight the edges in green. It is incredibly hard to see when the sprite collide. Let me see if I can change the color real quick to make this easier to see. All right, you guys see that little like green edge on it? That green edge is where the hitboxes are. And by default, Unity is really good at figuring out with squares and rectangles. Um, it gets a little bit harder with circles and stuff, and you might have to manually tweak it by messing with these numbers here. But if you're just using rectangles, which I am doing for the sake of I am lazy, it'll work fine. So, you might notice over here in the hierarchy, things are getting a little bit messy. That's why we create empties. So, if I create an empty, I make sure to zero my empty, otherwise, I'm going to get some funky numbers, and I don't like funky numbers. For reference, here is a different game that I was working on, and I did not center this prefab. So these guys all have funky numbers, and when I wrote them down and tried to copy them into this game, it didn't work. So center your empties. Now I might call this in between walls. And then I can click and drag these into this empty and add this into that. And wow, that's nice and organized. So now that we've done a real quick review, I'm going to move on to what I was hoping to start doing today. And that is, so far the player can only move around and pick up coins. I want to do some more interesting stuff. So I am going to make, not a square. Everything's a square. Let's do an isometric diamond. And I'm going to call this my torch. And what I want to have happen is I want to be able to pick up this torch, and this is now like a cool thing. And it'll be more evident um once I start doing the animation, which is still a little while off. So I'm going to make a torch tag. By tagging this, it essentially allows me to treat any torch that I make. So, like if I make multiple levels of this, I have a whole bunch of different torches that you can pick up. I can reuse the same script because everything is tagged torch. And I'm going to give this an edge collider, and I'm going to make it a trigger. Um, Another thing that I want is I want to have a key. Keys are cool, real helpful. I'm going to do this 9 sliced because that sounds funky. I'm going to move it over here. Ooh, I'm going to move my key up here. So you'll have to like move off the screen and go explore. And this is going to be our key. I'm going to tag it as a key. And what I want to have happen is I want to have like a lantern, and I want to have it that you have to pick up the torch, go light the lantern, and then that'll make the key appear. That's like a standard Zelda puzzle, and people asked me to make a Zelda clone. So I'm going to tag this as a key. And then the last thing that we need for this little puzzle is we need a lantern. So I'm going to put the lantern in the same room as the key. And one thing that up here, you see this little checkbox? If I click that, it turns off its activeness. So it no longer um, is active, like it still exists, but I just can't mess with it right now. That will allow us to like set it active, and ooh, the key magically appears when you solve the puzzle. Are there any questions so far? I'm gonna take this silence as a good thing. Okay. Uh, was the camera covered in the last session? Yes, that was. Um, yeah, haha. I can go over it real quick. Yeah. It might just be faster for you to go look at that, but the basic understanding of what I did was I made these little edges over here. So there's an edge over here. So you can see like these white boxes here where the edge of the camera is, and these like green lines are just before it. And I just use that as a collider and say, oh, well, if I hit an edge, then I'm going to look at what edge it is and I'm going to move the camera that way. Um, Please check out the recording for that for more information, because I really would like to get through this puzzle. Okay, making sure that I add on another collider. I'm gonna make this a box because I'm feeling lazy. I do not want this one to be a trigger. I do want the key to be a trigger. This is also a trigger, and maybe, I don't know, we have a door. So I'm gonna make a little door here. It's gonna be long and thin. It's gonna have a box collider, and it's not gonna be a trigger because I don't want you to be able to go through the door without a key. Yes, it's set up like a grid, so you could just go around. Um, Again, I'm not trying to make like a. I'm trying to make like a single level, and the idea is that you guys know the basics and can go out and make actual games with the basics. Is that everything? So we have a door. It's tagged as door, and it's got a non-trigger collider, lantern, tagged as lantern, not as a door. It's a lantern, also not a collider. A torch as a trigger. It's a key. I also want to be tagged as a key. Okay. And then what is this? What's that square? That's gonna go up here in the in-between walls. So you can see how organizing everything has made things way nicer in my hierarchy. Because otherwise we'd have well over 100 sprites already, and that's a lot. And you've seen how basic everything is right now. It gets even more complicated when you're actually trying to make things look nice. So, now that we have everything tagged properly, let's go ahead and start messing with our player script. It's a little cold in my room. Alright, first thing is I want to have a boolean. Do I have my torch? I'm going to call this torch. And I want it to be false by default. Um, do I have my torch? Yes or no? I'm pretty sure that by default, boolean is false, but I'm doing that just to be sure because redundancy is not all that bad. I also want to have an int key num, and it's going to equal 0. Key num is going to be the number of keys that we have. I really need to go through and document this better. I will do that before I make my next GitHub push. Next thing we want to do So down here is where we are doing all the scripting for our colliders. Our trigger colliders. Very important that you do the trigger stuff here and then the collision stuff in the other one. Otherwise, you will have errors. Errors that are difficult to debug because technically everything compiles. Runtime errors are super fun. So I'm going to do if other dot game object. So we are getting as a parameter for this function the collider for the object, and in order to get the actual item, we do other dot game object, and that'll give us the game object for this collider that we got. So if that, and then we're gonna compare tag. We're gonna look at what's this item tagged as, and if it's the torch, then lantern, no, then torch equal true, and I want to destroy other dot game object. You can only get one torch, and then it will destroy itself. If other dot game object dot compare key. We're gonna add one to keynum. And then we're also gonna destroy. One reminder about destroy is that it only does that while you're testing the game. So every time that you reset the game, those objects are going to come back. It's pretty much just setting it as deactive, but in this case, it is removing that item entirely, which makes things a little bit nicer, runtime wise. If you have less items existing, then it's less things you have to calculate. Are there any questions? This seems pretty straightforward so far. Okay. Um. All right. The next thing that we're gonna do is our void collision enter 2D. And what this is this keeps track of the collisions, the standard types of collisions, and not the trigger collisions. And remember, it has to be in a different one, otherwise, you have to use the proper. You got to do everything this specific way, otherwise, everything will not work. And that's what happened when I was testing this. And the parameter for this is collision 2D other. And then it's pretty much the same thing inside there. The only difference between trigger and collision is just parameter type and whether or not the person can pass through it. So if other dot game object dot pair tag. So if this is the door and I have a key, I want to destroy the door. Note, I don't have to do anything. Like, I don't have to tell it, don't bump into this thing. I don't have to tell it, don't do this, don't do that. It does that for me. And then I also want to remove one of the keys. You know, it's like a Zelda game, I suppose. And I saved it, and I have no issues found, which is all fine and good. Um, Another thing that I can do while running this is I can debug.log opened door. Debug.log is like a system.out.print. I have no idea what I just did there. Ah, holding control and scrolling zooms out. Um, so this is system.out.print line. And you can add in little debug statements in order to help you figure out what's going on. So that's all fine and dandy. Um, and then once we add that, it's sometimes nice to go back over here and make sure that everything works. So like if you don't have a tag that works, it'll let you know. So you can see I still can't go through the door. Um, I don't have the key set active yet. But if I go, I got the torch. Now I have the torch. However, my lantern doesn't work. One thing that I would like to do, personally, for me, is the lantern. I could have a whole bunch of different lanterns, and I want each of them to have their own respective keys. And if I try to do it where the player is keeping track of, this is this key for that lantern, and this is that key for that lantern, and to make everything super specific, um, I'm gonna end up having to like reuse a lot of stuff. So I want to have the lantern have its own script. Like go to new script, and I'm gonna make this the lantern script. This is going to keep track of, have I been set on fire, yes or no, and if I have been set on fire, then go activate my key. So I'm gonna edit this by edit script, and now it opens up in Visual Studio. I don't need either of these because it's not doing anything once per frame. Um, so we need a public game object key. And just to remind of what that does, when this recompiles, now I have this little slot here where I can plug in a key. So I can plug in his key. Um, and then I want to void on void collision enter 2D, because that's the type of collider that is the way that it works with the players colliders and all that. If you want more details on why I'm using collision enter here, please go back and check the video I did on collisions. um if we bumped into the player, I want to know, do you have the torch? So if other.gameObject.get component, this is going to allow us to access something that is listed here. So these are all the components, and I want to get the player movement script. So get component top down player movement. And then I add that because that's a function. I want to have a getter for um letting other things know if we have the torch. So it's a very simple getter function. So we're gonna get lantern torch. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna go and if we have the torch, then key dot set active true. Else I want to put out a debug statement saying giving a little advice to me as to why my thing isn't working. Are there any questions thus far? So, what happened here is I forgot an if statement. Um, we get a collision 2D, and then we have to get if other dot game object dot compare tag if this is the player. That goes here. Are there any questions? I know that I've kind of, huh? Oh, public. I know that I've gone kind of fast, but I've been trying to explain everything as I do it. Um, so like when I bump into this, I get a little message that says, "Get the torch, dingus." Oh no, I need to go get my torch. It doesn't activate the key yet. So I go and I got the torch. Alright, so now I go back down and I bump into it and it sets the key active. Woo! And now I can get the key. And now, and I go and I bump into the door. Didn't work. Why didn't the door work? Why didn't the door work? Why didn't the door work? Hmm. On. That's important. Um, I know that I've gone kind of fast, but I hope this all makes sense. So this is how you do like a basic, I don't know what you'd call this, Metroidvania type thing. I got the key. Now I was able to open the door. And wow, I solved the puzzle. Next week we're gonna go over enemies. But if no one has any questions, then I guess we're done here. Because I'm just trying to do a little bit of game stuff at a time.
I got a question, but you said next week you're doing like enemies.
Yeah. Next time we're gonna have like a little enemy that's gonna like move back and forth and try to attack the player, and we're gonna do like lives and stuff and respawning.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the question I was had is it's like so far like things get destroyed. Like you pick up a coin and it destroys it. But
Yes.
I guess there's a like an opposite way of doing that, so you can have like enemies spawn in and things and create like new coins and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So is that what you're gonna be
Yeah.
touching on that?
I'm gonna
Okay.
touch on that tomorrow, or not tomorrow, next week. I'm just trying to do a little bit at a time of like, we do the collisions and we can have the collisions require other things and set other things active. And now the next week is going to be, haha, you enter a room and enemies spawn in. Um, and maybe the doors lock and you have to kill the enemies to make the key drop. Um,
I have a question.
all right.
So basically, broadly speaking, collisions are the way that a player interacts with the game world. Like they go somewhere to some object or location, and once they do that, it kind of just sets off another event where maybe they'll be the camera will be moved somewhere else, or some value will be increased, anything like that.
Yes. Collisions are how everything is done, pretty much. Um, if you're running off the edge, you might have a little detector that says, hey, you're colliding with the edge. Or if you are trying to pick up an object, it's all just collisions. That's what I tried to say at the beginning of this is everything that I'm going to be doing next week, apart from making the enemies spawn in, is pretty much just going to be messing with colliders. Um, So once you understand colliders and if you have a little bit of creativity, it should be pretty easy to be like, oh, so that's how I would do this thing, and that's how I would do that thing. That's how I would make a, I don't know, swing the sword, and if I hit something with my sword, then it does this. Um, yeah, everything is collisions, which is why it's really important to understand the bare fundamentals of how the walls work and how the coins work. And I tried to like build this up so that way we go slowly and not jump straight into making enemies.
All right, thank you. That cleared things up a little bit for me.
Um, any other questions? If not, I'm gonna wrap this up.
All right. Well, thanks again for doing this.
Yeah, no problem.